What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moaning. If you guys are new here, then what's up? My name's Erica. Heya! How you doing? And for today's video, my guest truly needs no introduction. He is one of the most, if not the most famous independent scholar in the classics industry. He's published countless translations of Plato's dialogues, as well as some incredibly famous non-fiction books, including Why Socrates Died, and a collection of Greek myths, which may be what you guys know him most for, because I know that you guys are very much mythology enthusiasts. However, today we are here to discuss his new publication with Oxford University Press, titled Plato of Athens, A Life in Philosophy, as you can see, which is sitting right behind me. Which means that my guest today is none other than the amazing Robin Waterfield. Now, before we can get into the nitty-gritty of this book and all of my burning questions that I had whilst I was reading it, the way that I like to start all of these interviews is by asking my guests to give us a little bit of context for their classics background. So, how did you discover classics? When did you discover classics? And talk us through that journey of becoming the Robin Waterfield who now sits in front of me.
Well, I don't know, I would attribute it to either an accident or to destiny, but perhaps both. What happened was simply that I received a very, very traditional private school education in England, which meant, among other things, among all the horrible aspects, which meant that I started Latin at the age of 8 and ancient Greek at the age of 10. And languages were always my strong suit. Um, they virtually had to invent a maths O level for me to manage to pass. I mean, it was a farce. Um, and actually, at a certain stage, when I went on to my first public school, Shrewsbury, my best subject was French. Really, my best language was French. And there was this thing in the on the timetable at Shrewsbury where you couldn't do both German and ancient Greek. They coincided on the curriculum. So I thought I wanted to switch to modern languages, since, as I say, French was I mean, languages in general, but French in particular was my best subject. So I went to my form teacher and said, I think I want to give up ancient Greek and do German. And he said, I wouldn't if I were you, Robin. And so I didn't. So then I went on and did O levels and A levels and university. And I suppose it was, I mean, I was a typical stroppy teenager. I didn't do much work and things, but so I think I probably really fell in love with it at university, and decided that I was going to make the classics was going to inform my life in some way or another. I hoped as a university teacher, but well, yeah, we'll come to that as well. That's another of your questions, but yeah, that didn't happen. But no, so that was it really. Just the accident of having had a traditional public school education.
What was it
And
about languages that drew you in?
I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. I mean, some people just are good at languages and some people are good at sciences. And, I wasn't good at sciences and I was good at languages. And that's really all there was to it. Uh, Partly, it might again be slightly accidental because the prep school I was at before I went on to Shrewsbury was so Spartan and old-fashioned in many ways that science was virtually non-existent. I mean, there was not a science lab at the school in my day. There is now, of course. Um, and so really, languages, English, um, maths, obviously, history, were the subjects that were taught with a strong emphasis on the classics. I mean, we would have had one Latin and one Greek lesson per day, I think, and the same with French and maths and so on and so forth. But science consisted at that time of the school's what do you call him, vicar, priest, I don't know, coming into the classroom and saying, "Okay, boys, now pull apart your watches." And that, to see how they work. And I mean, that was really all we did science, and that was only once a week as opposed to once a day. So science was really downplayed. So perhaps that And I think I do have a natural talent for languages, but that would have been that environment would have pushed me in that direction anyway, I think. So,
So you mentioned the one of my questions, which it
ah,
is one of my questions, is that you didn't go down the route of being a professor. So do you want to explain, if you wouldn't mind?
we're going to get political. Um, I wanted to be a university lecturer. That's what I set my heart on. I decided I did my undergraduate degree at Manchester University, and I went on to do work for a PhD, which I never completed at Cambridge. Um, and the whole purpose of this was the whole purpose of slogging through a PhD, which eventually I didn't believe in, was in order to end up as a university lecturer. I really wanted it, and I did get it. I was a university lecturer for 4 years, but only in a series of 1 year replacement jobs. When people were taking a year's leave, I was brought in. So I did a year at Newcastle University under those circumstances, and then 3 1-year jobs in succession at St Andrews. And at the end of that, I was a specialist at the time in ancient Greek philosophy, not history. And at the end of that time, at the end of my fourth 1-year job, there were simply no jobs in ancient philosophy, just none. And the reason for that is, as I say, political. Because by the time, okay, so the years we're talking about are, if I can get them right, I graduated from Manchester in 1974. I was in Cambridge for 4 years until 1978, and then I had these series of 1-year lectureships until 1982. Now, certainly by 1981, possibly even by 1980, Mrs. Thatcher's government had decided to, well, stomp on the universities, frankly. It's a really extraordinary story, so I'll just tell it briefly because people should know their history. That through her henchman, who was a man called Michael Joseph, all universities received a letter from the Department of Education. And the letter said, right, your next year's budget is going to be £10 million. You'll notice that this is a decrease in real terms of whatever percentage. And it didn't stop there. They then went on to say, we suggest that you close such and such a department, or that you merger with Hull University, which is nearby, or that you lose 2 jobs from such and such a department. And among the such and such departments that were hit were classics departments. So as I say, but when the time came at the end of 1982, there were simply no jobs for me at all. And I very quickly discovered, I mean, universities were frankly in a panic. Individuals were in a panic because, what was the point of undertaking a 5-year research project if you didn't know whether you're going to have a job in 5 years' time? So individuals were in a panic. Universities were in a panic because they had no money. And one of the consequences of their having no money was, as I discovered very quickly, so I managed to creep into Penguin. They were publishing my first book at the time, a translation of Plato's Philebus, and I crept in through a sort of a side door as a copy editor there they had an in-house copy editorial department in those days. It wasn't outsourced. And I worked there for a few years. And after only a few months there, I was keeping an eye on the university job adverts, and one came up that more or less said wanted Robin Waterfield. It had my special field in it and blah, blah, blah. And I didn't even get an interview. And I knew the professor, the ancient philosophy world is a small world. So I wrote to him afterwards and said, what happened? And he said, Robin, you're too old. Because, by that time I was 30, they could employ somebody with a new PhD graduate, aged 24, for 6 years less salary. And that was it. And that in those days, that had to be a decisive factor for at least some universities, many universities. So that was it. And again, you discover once you're out, you're out. It's a rat race like any other. You need to be in the swim. I was publishing stuff or trying to publish stuff and keep my name, but it wasn't good enough. And the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that I didn't finish my PhD certainly did me no favors. I perhaps foolishly in hindsight. I mean, I've always loved writing. I think part of the attraction of being an academic, being a university teacher, was that I got to write stuff. So instead of finishing my PhD, which by then totally bored me, I decided to just start publishing stuff.
What was your PhD on? Can I ask?
Yeah, this dialogue of Plato's, the Philebus. And it's a puzzling dialogue, and it has there's a major kind of schism in it, where he uses certain terminology in one way at the beginning of the dialogue, which is totally incompatible with the way that it's used later in the dialogue. So it looks like it's a pastiche dialogue of some kind. I was trying to reconcile those two bits of the dialogue, and it wasn't really working. And by the time so I went off to Newcastle for my first job. I was busy writing lectures, especially at St Andrews. The St Andrews regime for lecturers is really fierce. So I was always writing lectures. And by the time I sort of turned around to look at my PhD thesis again, I didn't believe it and I was bored. So, but I mean, it worked out okay. Look, I'm happy. I mean, I'm living in southern Greece, making a living as a writer, which is like a dream come true. Yeah, so it could be worse.
Well, also with this focus on Plato, which I just think is phenomenal. Like you have so much work that is at least inspired by Plato, if not directly using it. And so I was wondering, I mean, you've dedicated so many years of your life to Plato.
Yeah.
What is it about Plato that keeps drawing you back in that really fascinates you?
Oh, I mean, because where else would one want to be spending one's time except in the presence of genius? I mean, really, it's as simple as that. He's endlessly fascinating because, he was writing at a time when there was little or no technical vocabulary for philosophers. So, so there are certain imprecisions in what he says, and scholars are still trying to figure them out. They have been during his lifetime and ever since, for over 2,000 years. So he's fascinating in that way, that there are still chances of feeling that you're getting closer to what he was really saying. And scholars, tweak away at this sentence and that paragraph and that dialogue, to try to do that. So he's endlessly fascinating in that way, but he's also endlessly fascinating simply as a writer. I mean, he wrote philosophical dialogues, as you know, and lots of people since then, Bishop Berkeley, lots of other people have written philosophical dialogues, but just none of them match Plato's at all. The conversational realism of what he's writing is just brilliant, and also like all works of great literature, I think, a generalization, but hell, what the hell? Like all works of great literature, you often, when you read The Republic, you often feel there's slightly more going on just under the surface of the dialogue than you're quite grasping. And that makes you return again and again and again to a work to try to see if you can capture some of those nuances. And of course, now that I'm a professional translator and have been for 40 years, that's really a major part of the job of translations. And it's the great pleasure of translation for me, is the feeling that you've not just got a sentence, you've not just got the surface meaning of a sentence right and put it into modern English, but you've also captured at least something of the nuances as well. And that to me is I think pretty much the greatest pleasure of my life.
Well, taking all of this into consideration, we are here to discuss your new book, which is a biography of Plato. So I was wondering, after translating so much Plato and dedicating so much of your life to Plato, when did that switch come that you decided you were going to take on this project?
It wasn't my decision. I was approached by the publisher. That's how publishing works. I mean, sometimes I come up with an idea and approach a publisher and say, how about it? And sometimes, once you're established, as I suppose I am, then you stand a better chance of a publisher turning to you. So Oxford University Press in New York, Stefan Vranke, the editor, said, how about it? And I leapt at it. But I mean, Erica, what's weird, and people should know because it's so strange. I mean, Plato is a household name, and there are very, very, I mean, Socrates, Plato, there are very few philosophers that one can think of that are actually that widely known. This is the first ever biography, book-length biography. And that's really odd. But I mean, there are very good scholarly reasons for that. The evidence is patchy. Um, some of the main evidence consists of in letters that have come down to us under Plato's name. And if one thinks that some of those are authentic, then you gain a great deal of information about his life. But there are many scholars who don't think any of the letters are authentic, and therefore, that's going to make it very hard for them to write a biography because there's very little information left after that. But I think that three of these letters are genuine, and we've got other sources, not his dialogues. His dialogues are singularly unhelpful. I mean, okay, you can get some insights into his character, I guess, by what he says, though even that is a dangerous way to approach biography. The example I use in the preface or introduction to my book is Vladimir Nabokov, who famously wrote a book called Lolita about a man who was obsessed with an underage girl. But Nabokov wasn't obsessed himself with underage girls. He was just writing a book. So you get that, so as I say that trying to read Plato's character off his dialogues is difficult because he's never in his dialogue. He's like a playwright. He puts Socrates and other characters in his works. But it's never Plato says this. We think, a lot of people think that Socrates is sort of a spokesman for Plato, especially in the more doctrine building middle period dialogues. But other than that, it's slightly hazardous to infer a writer's character from what he says in his book. So very little information from his books, from the letters, and then there are a whole bunch of ancient biographies. Unfortunately, none of those that were written shortly after his lifetime have survived. The earliest one that survives, very fragmentary, is from the 1st century BC, and most of them are much later. And they're not very helpful at all. The broad kind of trajectory of his life, they get right, but the information is often very gossipy, often downright silly. Plato died of embarrassment when he couldn't solve a riddle. The scholars in the academy blinded themselves so that they would be able to concentrate more on philosophy.
Okay, but those are great stories. We love a good gossipy story, though.
Yeah. Well, they are. They're like the Hello magazine. They're like the sort of celebrity gossip of the ancient world. These writers. So again, not much use. But the fact that the information is patchy, so that with his letters we know quite a lot about his visits to Syracuse and his attempts to reform Dionysius II, the tyrant of Syracuse, and turn him into a constitutional monarch with some democracy also under him. So we know about that. We know about, he founded the academy, and we know certain bits and bobs from his life, or we can infer them from what we know about Athenians of that social stratum. But other than that, there are huge areas of where we don't know any specific incidents. But I mean, my personal opinion is that that's not inaccurate. I think between these sort of major events, the visits to Syracuse and the foundation of the academy and things like that, between these events, I think he was living a quiet, scholarly life of, reading and writing and teaching. In the book, I compare him to Tolkien because I'm a Tolkien freak, so I do. I mean, Tolkien wrote these fantastic books, but in himself, he just lived the sort of dry, dusty life of an Oxford Don. Very little to say about his life. So I think Plato was like that. I think there literally wasn't that much going on in his life. Reading, writing, teaching, and then these major events.
Which sounds like a pretty good life, I'll be honest. It doesn't sound half bad. But I thought that the best way that we could go about this conversation with regards to the details of your book, that I kind of want to nitpick a little bit, is to kind of do it chronologically. So it kind of might jump from topic to topic quite randomly.
Fine.
So we'll start with when I go through books, basically, I always look to think my audience are newbies. So if they were to pick up this book, what might they point out and think, oh, that's a bit odd, or I don't really get that. And
Yeah.
so those are the questions that I come with. And one
Okay.
of them was on page 31. So if you guys at home have that, you can turn to page 31. If not, I'll read out this small quote just so that we all know where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
So it reads, the Olympian gods were present in the world, their influence immediately visible. Zeus made it rain, Poseidon caused earthquakes, Demeter made cereal crops grow, and so on. The monotheistic tradition of Greek thought was always an attempt to transcend this worldly perspective. Given what we know of Plato's character from his philosophy, with its otherworldly emphasis on the soul and transcendent forms, his entry into the club of Greek monotheists should hardly occasion surprise. So I thought about that people are going to struggle with this idea of monotheism, Plato, because I think a lot of people come into this subject, and even people who are comfortable in the subject always think the world is polytheistic until they get into philosophy, and then it's this whole basically hole full of like random stuff that's sitting in there that you kind of have to sift through. So do you want to explain the use of the word monotheism in there with regards to Plato?
All right. So first of all, there was a slight monotheistic tradition. It started with a chap called Xenophanes of Colophon, who wrote lyric poetry, and mostly he totally disavowed polytheism. Um, I should have looked up exact quotes, but basically he said there's one God, and his conception of one God was he's all-seeing, all-knowing. He doesn't have human features. Xenophanes pours scorn on. He says if cattle could draw, they depict their gods as cattle. Thracian gods have red hair, he says. So he totally tries to throw that away. Um, he was probably a prophet crying in the wilderness. I mean, there doesn't seem to have been many people who leapt up and said, "Oh yes, Xenophanes, you're right. Yeah, I don't believe in the many gods anymore." Then a contemporary of Plato's, a fellow follower of Socrates called Antisthenes, also seems to have done much the same, although we don't have his work. It's just sort of second, third-hand reports about what he said. So let's just be clear that there was at least some degree of a monotheistic tendency. But for me, in the book, although in the preface I said I'd towed a fairly conservative line on most issues in Platonic scholarship, that's not the case here, unfortunately. There are many scholars who don't believe that Plato was a monotheistic or even had a monotheistic tendency. The only book on Plato's theology that I included in the bibliography was one by a man called Van Riel, and I'll read you what he says so as not to make sure I don't distort anything. The discussion in the previous chapter has shown that Plato tends to use the god as a generic name or a common denominator for all that is divine. It is a shortcut used to discuss the qualities of all things divine in general, rather than a statement about there being only one God. So there's him, and there's a bunch of other scholars who don't believe that Plato was in any sense a monotheist. But I can't read. I mean, there are certain passages, especially in Timaeus, but I can't read otherwise. I mean, in the Timaeus, as you know well from your lost thesis, the demiurge is a singular deity. He's the creator, and he uses the multiple lesser deities as his servants. He's called the father and creator of the other gods. I mean, look, here are a couple of texts. Timaeus 30a. For the God wanted everything to be good, marred by as little imperfection as possible. He found everything visible in a state of turmoil, moving in a discordant and chaotic manner. So he led it from chaos to order. This is a singular dog. This is a singular God, right? Follows that we're bound to think that this world of ours was made in truth by God as a living being, endowed, thanks to his providence, with soul and intelligence. Anyway, I won't go on, but there are many, many passages throughout the Timaeus which I can't read other than saying there was a singular God, and that, and as I said on page 31, apparently, that's not surprising because, as I say, the Olympian gods were linked to the world more than Plato, more than as I read Plato's character. For him, the gods were soul. They were immaterial. That means that they could make changes in the world, but they didn't have this. The multiple Olympian gods had the connection to the world, but Plato, his character is such that he would have wanted there to be a higher god, something immaterial, something more than that. And that's how I read the Timaeus. But it's controversial.
I mean, but I agree with that because I read it as very deistic, because the idea is that that craftsman comes in and then leaves and leaves the other
Yes,
gods in charge. So,
yes.
which is a deistic idea.
Deism, exactly, yes, yes.
And also that links to, if I'm not mistaken, Anaxagoras, who's also pre-Socratic, who had his idea of the nous, which was, okay, not really like a god, but still is this idea of like one entity thing that was over the earth as well.
No, that's a very good comparison, because for Plato, God was nous. God was, a rational being. He wanted to, from the passage I've just read, he wanted to impose order on the chaos that he found. So he looks to the archetypes, if you like, the forms, and he uses them to create the world and create it in an orderly fashion. Yeah. And because he's nous, because he is rationality with a capital R, if you like. Yeah.
So moving along in
Yes.
your biography to pages 74 to 75. Again, you guys can all go and check this, but I'm not going to quote you, don't worry, because it's the general discussion of what it means to publish in the ancient world. And what you were saying was how, Plato would have written something and then he would have read it, and then somebody might have said, oh, that was really interesting, can I copy some of that? And then they would have copied, and so on and so forth. It keeps going. Now, this might be a completely irrational thought on my part, but I read this and I went, oh my goodness, how do we know that what we have then is Plato's final version rather than one of these in the middle versions, or possibly as it gets, again, this is like me going down a rabbit hole, as it's getting copied, something gets smudged and...
It's not a rabbit hole. It's a very, very relevant question, and particularly to, you say, your audience is newbies. This is a fundamental question in studying classics. They really should have some idea of the process. But yes, you're right. So until the invention of the printing press, all work was copied by scribes, particularly after, within Christianity, in scribes' works in the monasteries. And scribes make mistakes. We know that from our own copying of a passage. We put a comma wrong, or we misspell something, or we get somebody's name wrong, or something like that. It's easy to do. It's a sort of a Chinese whispers on paper. Now, Plato's a slightly different case because he was so popular that the texts that have come down to us are probably pretty accurate. But there are other people, other writers, and also more obscure passages. Like, for instance, let's take a playwright like Euripides. Okay, so a play of Euripides consists of episodes, scenes, interspersed with some really intense, beautiful, but very dense, often lyric poetry. And the meter of some of these poems of his is extremely hard to decipher. So scribes were introducing error after error after error when they come to difficult passages like that. Less so in prose, so with Plato, etc., etc. One of the most unfortunate consequences of, I should say, this might be very old-fashioned of me, but the fundamental book on this when I was growing up is a book called Scribes and Scholars. And I thoroughly recommend it. It's really easy to read and really informative. And I think it's gone into several editions. So I would recommend that to you and to all our listeners. One consequence of this, of the scribal tradition, is, this is a slight digression from your question, but let's take a historian like Diodorus of Sicily. He's not very highly rated as a historian, but he wrote a universal history in 40 books. We don't have all 40 books, but we do have quite a lot. Now, universal historians like Diodorus were basically writing compendiums of other people's work. He would have read Timaeus of Taramenium, a Sicilian historian, to write about Sicilian history. He read a lot of Ephorus of Kyme, very important 4th century historian whose work's lost to us, but we think that a lot of Diodorus's work is based on that. So one of the unfortunate consequences of the scribal tradition is that because Diodorus did his whole history in 40 books, people said, oh, well, that's easier than me reading, 30 books of Timaeus and 50 books of Ephorus and 60 books of that historian and 10 books of that historian, so on and so forth. So we'll just have Diodorus, and all the others have got lost, you see. That's how Greek literature has got lost, largely, also through accident, and once possibly through design. I think I'm right in saying that up until, let's say, the 13th or 14th century, this is a guess, there was still a complete manuscript of Sappho's poems around. And some prurient abbot decided it was, too lurid and destroyed the manuscript. I think. This might be just a rumor and hearsay, but anyway. So, right, to go back to your main question, how do we know that what we're reading is accurate? Well, the answer is we can know with a high degree of certainty because of the work of previous generations of scholars. Particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, you had that was if you like, the main work of classicists in those days wasn't just interpreting the texts, but establishing the texts. And a lot of the work they did then, they went overboard. They were making changes which we now see are unnecessary in their attempts to establish the definitive text. They were doing some unnecessary stuff, so we had to prune back quite a lot. But so today you go to a bookshop and you buy the Oxford Classical Text or the Teubner or the Bude or the Loeb, whatever you found out through your research is the standard text. Alberti's text of Thucydides, for instance, that's not in any of those series. And you translate that. And it's that text published, let's say, in 1960 or 2010, is the fruit of all those decades of previous scholarship. So you can be pretty sure that you're pretty close to what Plato wrote and what Thucydides wrote. Having said that, there has never yet, I've got something like 35 volumes of translations out, and some of them include more than one work. So I've translated a lot of ancient Greek works, and there's never been one, I don't think, where I haven't tweaked the text to a certain extent, and sometimes to quite a large extent, where a text's been relatively neglected, both in earlier centuries and by modern scholars. And I'm generally finding, at least 2 or 3 or half a dozen places where I think I can improve on the text. And I translate the improved text, and I always put an appendix at the back of my translation saying, in case you need to know, this is what I'm reading at this point.
Well, that's fantastic to hear. So there's no way of segueing into this quote because all of this was fabulous, but this next part that's later on in the text has just nothing to do with it. So right. I even wrote a note to be like, just note that this has nothing to do with the previous question. But it's on page 106. And for me, this was probably the most important page that you wrote, not to toot your horn in front of you or anything. But so I'll read a bit for you guys, which says, starting at the top of the page, he, and this he is like a general he. This is not Plato he. So he might think he has knowledge, but it turns out that he has only beliefs. Knowledge is certain, knowledge is of the truth, and knowledge is irrefutable. Beliefs are commonly based on persuasive agents such as common sense, popular opinions, emotions, advertisements, talking heads, eloquent speakers, and are therefore unstable in that they can alter under the influence of a more persuasive agent. The trouble, as Plato saw it, is that we go ahead and act on the basis of our beliefs, not realizing that they are only beliefs and not knowledge. So that for me was unbelievably important. And as the author, you don't have to include everything, but this to me seemed very poignant. So I was wondering why you felt the need to include this specific passage in your book.
Well, I mean, firstly, just for interpretive reasons. I mean, the distinction between knowledge and belief is of critical importance throughout Plato's work. It first crops up in the early dialogues, the so-called Socratic dialogues, and it's spelled out with some vigor and at some length in some of the middle dialogues. So, firstly, just because it was important to Plato, I have to include it in his biography. But secondly, I'm not a big, I'm a kind of a pure classicist. I like to try to understand Plato and others on their own ground. For instance, to take an aside for a moment, but I want to try to remember what I'm talking about because I tend to lose my thread. But I've translated a couple of Stoic texts, Mark Aurelius and Epictetus. Now, I don't know whether you know, but at the moment there's a big movement called modern Stoicism. There are tens of thousands of people around the world who are practicing or consider themselves to be practicing Stoicism. But when I translated Marcus and Epictetus, I didn't read a word of any of those modern Stoic books because I want to understand Marcus and Epictetus in their own time, in their own words, not influenced by anything else. For the same reason, in all my years of studying Plato, I've scarcely touched on the Neoplatonists because they had a very, very definite, and the Middle Platonists, they had a very, very definite understanding of what Plato was up to, which may or may not be what he was up to. So I just want to look at Plato and see what he was saying in himself. So in that sense, as I say, I'm a pure classicist. In that sense, I don't want to taint it with anybody else's interpretation, however influential. Whereas, largely, I'm a pure classicist. I do believe that this distinction between belief and knowledge is something that everybody should and could think about. Particularly today with the vast influence of social media and influencers and creatives and so on and so forth. You have to remember that everything you read on Facebook, everything you see on TikTok or read on Instagram or something is not a fact. It's a belief. You can make it a belief. You can turn the belief into knowledge by doing your own thinking about it, by doing your own research about it. Plato says in Meno, he tells you how to do that. He says, okay, you've got a belief, but once you've worked, and it could be a true belief, but once you've worked out whether or not it's true, and if it's true, why it's true, then you've converted your belief into knowledge. So instead of just the passive reception of stuff from social media, Plato, I think, if he was around today, he would encourage us to convert everything. So you need to just think about what MTG and other people are telling you and try to work out for yourself whether you actually think that's a fact and whether it's something that you know or whether it's simply something you believe. I mean, true belief, as Plato says, is, beliefs can be either true or false. And true belief, as Plato says, is a perfectly good guide to life. But because it is still only belief, it can still be undermined. If somebody comes along who's more persuasive and persuades you that what is actually true belief is false, then you're going to shed it. Whereas if you actually know it, if you've done the hard work of converting your belief into knowledge, then nobody's going to shake it. The truth is irrefutable.
Leading on from this idea of what Plato thought and presumably what he taught, my favorite part of the entire biography was the discussion of the academy. I was
Yeah.
completely glued to this section of the book. I thought it was fascinating. But when discussing the academy, you begin it by sort of trying to figure out how people would have gotten into the academy. And so you use the Republic a lot for this. And you do say that throughout the text where, you're saying Plato probably had some sort of a test. You say that he was probably looking for people that had an affinity to philosophy, those who had an affiliation and love to truth, justice, courage, self-discipline, they had elegance, all of these qualities that you say is because seemingly Plato didn't like the idea that you could just show up and get a spot, whether it be free or paid. You kind of had to earn it. So I was wondering if you could explain this a little bit more of where that comes from with Plato.
Well, first of all, I mean, of course, it's only a guess that these passages from Republic applied to Academy, but it seems a perfectly reasonable guess. Secondly, it's the Socratic tradition, really. Socrates, Plato, and I think at least one other Socratic, perhaps Xenophon, perhaps Aeschines of Sphetus, I can't remember, but Plato certainly distinguishes, one of the ways he distinguishes Socrates from the people called the Sophists is precisely that Socrates didn't take money for his teaching, whereas Sophists did. So when Plato formed the Academy, he also didn't charge fees for anybody. Partly he could afford not to. He was very well off himself. Came from a wealthy family, and as far as we can tell, didn't decrease his income during his lifetime. He had slaves working his estates, as all upper class landowning Athenians did. So he never felt the need to charge people for studying or doing research at the academy. So I think that's all I need to say about that. It was the Socratic tradition. He felt that it was, if you taught people only because they could afford your fee, then that's kind of meretricious. I think that's very much Plato's feeling about it, that you're actually having to prostitute yourself to a certain extent. Whereas he was looking for people of sufficient caliber. And it's important to say sufficient caliber because let's go into what happened at the academy just briefly. As I see it, there were two main lines of work, which I think also were reflected in the two main buildings. I think that, you see, philosophy at the time wasn't a separate subject as we think of it now. It didn't become a separate subject until the beginning of the 19th century or thereabouts. Philosophy included mathematics, astronomy, geography, psychology, everything, all these sorts of things would have been included under the umbrella of the term philosophy. So philosophy at the time, in Plato's time, was, at least in part, it was simply the apex of your higher education. So if you were a well-born young man, who has to be men, unfortunately, in those days, if you were a well-born young man and you were concerned to have a good all-round education, you would top it off by attending some philosophy lectures. Not necessarily exclusively Plato's. There were plenty of other people around offering lectures in that type of subject. And so one strand of what went on in the academy was just this really pretty elementary teaching. And I think this went on in the gymnasium in the Academy Park, which was a little bit, a kilometer or two northwest outside of the city walls of Athens. So that's what I think. So I think, when we read that people like Demosthenes and Chabrias and people like that who turned into statesmen and politicians in Athens, when we read that they attended the academy, we shouldn't think of them as being like Aristotle attending the academy. We should think of them as having just going to some of Plato's lectures for a year or two, while possibly attending Isocrates' lectures at the same time, and so on and so forth.
Well, something you wrote about the academy, which I just thought was amazing, was on page 140, where you wrote that Plato saw his job as attracting and fostering fine intellectuals and groundbreaking work, not as turning out clones of himself.
Yeah, this to me was uh, a real eye opener. How clear the evidence is for this. So, okay, so one strand, as I see it, philosophy teaching, probably by Plato largely, perhaps by other members of the academy, in the gymnasium of the Academy Park. Now, Plato also, at some point quite early after the foundation of the academy, bought property near it, near the park. The park was a sacred area, so it wasn't in the park, as some people say it wasn't. It was outside, in the colonists area. And he built a house there. And it's clear that some work went on in the house. And I think the house, unlike the gymnasium, I think the house was the center of the research, the inner core of people who didn't just come for a year or two and listen to some lectures, but people, I mean, Aristotle was at the academy for 20 years, you know, and for all we know, didn't attend any lectures in the gymnasium. He might have done. Yeah, he probably did actually, because he went there as a young man. He was only 18 when he went there, but he stayed there for 20 years. And this is, I think, where the research was done and where Plato would have chaired discussions. And so this is where the work was being fostered by people like Aristotle and Eudoxus of Cnidus. Those are the two most important because they influenced generations of scientists afterwards. But there were others. Speusippus of Athens was important. Heraclides of Pontus was important. So this was the inner circle. These were Plato's prized students. Well, they weren't really students so much as to say as researchers. But what's really, yeah, one of the things that's really interesting about it is that although it's very hard to precisely date some of these people's work, not one of them, not Aristotle, not Eudoxus, not Speusippus, who became the head of the academy after Plato, not Xenocrates, who became the head of the academy after Speusippus, not one of them was turning out work which was identical to Plato's. They were basing their work on what Plato had written, and I'm sure the dialogues were discussion documents within this inner circle. Going back to Philebus, I mean, for instance, that's a kind of repository of views that academicians were coming up with about pleasure. So it was a discussion document for them to talk about pleasure. But not one of them. I mean, Plato's emblematic theory, I call it at one point in the book, is the theory of forms. The idea that we identify things because we have some glimmering of an ideal beauty that enables us to call things that approximate to it beautiful and so on and so forth. This idea, but not one. I mean, Aristotle completely repudiated that theory. Speusippus and Xenocrates both tweaked it mightily. So, as I say, none of them were doing work that it wasn't a school for the perpetuation of Platonism. It was a school, as in the quote of mine that you read out, to foster work, not to perpetuate Platonism. And that's of critical importance, of course. I mean, I don't know, at some point, if it had been a place to foster Platonism, people would have got bored and wanted to branch out on their own. And, it would have probably fizzled out. But the academy didn't fizzle out. It lasted in some form or another for about 1,000 years, which ain't bad.
But a question that I wanted to ask you, since you are the expert in Plato,
Yeah.
and you've spent
I'm,
so
I'm
many.
an expert in Plato. I'm certainly not the expert in Plato.
Well, an expert in Plato then. Through all of your studies, since you spent so many years with Plato, what has Plato on the whole, generally speaking, the discipline of looking at Plato's work taught you?
I would have said that studying Plato has not taught me anything that, for instance, studying Thucydides might not have, except insofar as Plato is a philosopher and that therefore one can perhaps adapt some of his work to one's own life and say, Okay, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe I could try to be a better person along Platonic lines. But other than that, I think it's simply the discipline of studying an ancient text, which is, I mean, in itself, it's an extraordinary thing to do because it's bound to give you, it's bound to foster a certain kind of intellectual activity and discipline. You've got a very limited body of evidence. We've got Plato's works. He's dead. He's not going to write anymore. So we've got this limited body of evidence. We've got Thucydides' history. That's all we've got to go on. And we apply critical thinking to this limited body. And I think that for me, that's why, I mean, this is going to sound very, very old-fashioned. I don't approve, but I can understand why in the old days, studying classics was considered to be enough for you then to go on to join the civil service, to go and teach others, to do virtually any job, to go into the business world. It was considered sufficient that you'd study classics because it does foster that kind of disciplined approach to disciplined and rational approach to things. So I think my study of Plato's taught me that, but as I say, perhaps no more than my study of any other ancient author. If I'd been a Virgil scholar, it might have been much the same.
So we have time for just one more question, if that's all right with you, Robin. But I love to end these videos on a piece of advice. So in this case, we've been discussing Plato throughout this video. So maybe for the people who are watching who want to learn more about Plato, but are quite intimidated by his texts, just because Plato is such a big name, not only in the ancient world, but also in the philosophy world. For that person that feels intimidated, for that person that feels nervous to open Plato, what's the advice that you can give to them?
I would say quite simply shed that prejudice. You can only think that reading Plato is difficult if you haven't read it. So you find a good translation of whichever work you want. This is the point at which I say I've done how many volumes of Plato translations with introductions. The introductions are also good, if they're written simply, they help to guide you. But in the first instance, I would advise people just to read the books. And there's no reason not to, because as I've been saying time and again, to you this afternoon, he's very readable. He really is very readable until you get to, Parmenides, Sophists. You have to work your way up to that. Just as I'm sure Parmenides and Sophists were not for the beginner philosophers in the academy. They were for the advanced students, the researchers. But the early dialogues are wonderful. The middle dialogues are wonderful, both in their own separate ways. And they're easy to read. Again, partly because there's no technical vocabulary, partly because he's dealing with, and this is true of nearly all ancient philosophers. They're not, the chief difference between ancient philosophy and philosophy as it's practiced today is philosophy as it's practiced today is something you do in university, in seminars. You explore concepts, you criticize other people's views and things like that. But ancient philosophy was, a lot of it was highly theoretical, but a lot of it was also highly practical. They were dealing with issues which were directly relevant to your life. Even stuffy old Aristotle, somewhere close to the beginning of Nicomachean Ethics, says we are studying the subject not to know what goodness is, but to be good people. Right? And that to me is the most exciting thing about ancient philosophy. And then especially when you get into the Stoics and people like that, because they're directly addressing their students about how to live. That's to me the most exciting thing, is that they are dealing with real live issues. They're not. It's not just concept analysis. So my advice to people would simply be pick up Plato, start reading.
100%, Robin. That was a great piece of advice. Thank you so much for joining me today. I have loved every single second of it, and I'm such a fan of your other books. So this really does mean a lot to me that you have sat down, taken the time out of your day to chit chat. So thank you again. And obviously, thank you guys for watching the videos. I hugely appreciate every single one of you. And it goes without saying that you guys can find all of the links in the description below. So if you want to buy Plato of Athens yourself, you want to join me in reading about the life of this incredible philosopher, do check out the description box below. I will also include some of the other translations of Platonic texts by Robin Waterfield down there as well, in case we also convinced you to pick any of those up. But thank you guys so much, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. So I'll see you guys then.